The hearing is called to order. I'd like to thank our witness for appearing today. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine proposed regulations by the U.S. Department of Labor pertaining to the employment of youth on farms and ranches. Like other sectors of the economy, farming and ranching have experienced profound changes over the years. The combination of mechanization, biotechnology, and the use of more specialized fertilizers has allowed farmers to grow more food using less land than at any time in history. While these new technologies and methods have brought significant change to agriculture, the need to educate and train the next generation of farmers remains as important today as it was nearly 100 years ago. It has often been said, but needs repeating here. Farming is a profession learned by doing, and while school-based instruction is important, it can teach youth a great deal, but there is no substitute for actual on-farm ranch experience. While I'm pleased by DOL's announcement yesterday that it was going to resubmit the parental exemption portion of the MPRM, other provisions of this rule will still make it difficult, if not impossible, for youths interested in careers in agriculture to access comprehensive on-farm education and employment opportunities. I think we can all agree that hazards are present in agriculture, and ensuring the safety of youth is a common goal. At the same time, through proper safety training and supervision, those hazards can be eliminated or at least minimized. We are fortunate to have with us today stakeholders involved in that process. They and their families have been involved in agriculture for generations, and I think they will bring an important perspective to the committee's discussions. Before I yield to Ranking Member Kritz for his opening statement, I would like to welcome our colleague, Representative Dennis Rayberg from the state of Montana. While he does not serve on the Small Business Committee, Denny is a fifth-generation rancher, and he's asked to be here today because this issue is so important to his constituents back home, just as it is to many of my own constituents. I now yield to Ranking Member Kritz for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Across America, farming is not just a source of food, but a way of life. In my home state of Pennsylvania, there are more than 63,000 farms, and more than 90% are family-owned and operated. This means that while they bring food to the nation's table, they are also an essential ingredient to rural economies, driving employment, innovation, and the quality of life. Making sure that this remains so is a top priority of mine. Central to family farming is the notion that children and local youths can participate in the agricultural way of life. For many, this may mean milking cows, cultivating a field, or repairing a barn. The skills and the responsibility these adolescents receive at such a young age help them become trustworthy and hardworking adults. Instilling such values is just as much a part of the family farm as is harvesting crops. In this regard, farmers have always prioritized health and safety in their fields and silos. Doing so not only safeguards their very own families, but is also necessary if they want to be successful. With this in mind, it is unfortunate that the Department of Labor's proposed regulation on child labor in agriculture could undermine much of what makes family farms so special. If enacted, the rule would equate agricultural labor with non-agricultural labor, something that makes no sense to anyone that has ever stepped foot in a rural community. Until yesterday, the most concerning part of the regulation was the narrowness in how DOL defines family farm. While it is promising that the agency has decided to repropose this portion of the rule, work still needs to be done. The matter at hand concerns the parental exemption from the regulation. Current law provides an exclusion for farms owned by a parent. This has generally been interpreted to include arrangements where the parent has an ownership interest, such as a partnership or a corporation. Such instances are fairly common among family farms, as multi-generational families, including grandparents, uncles, and aunts, may operate one entity instead of several. This is no trivial matter, as Pennsylvania alone has nearly 5,000 family-held corporations and partnerships. Reproposing this aspect of the rule is a step in the right direction, and if done properly, will ensure that children can continue to work on the very family-owned farms as the generations before them have done. In rural communities, farms are also centers of learning. In many areas of agriculture, hands-on experience is critical. No longer will 14 and 15-year-old children be able to readily participate in many aspects of farming operations, potentially shortchanging their careers. This change is ironic because during a period of high unemployment, particularly in rural communities, we should be expanding vocational education opportunities, not restricting them. At the center of the rule are changes to DOL's hazardous occupation orders. These orders provide the limits on what tasks adolescents can perform on a farm. While unchanged since 1970, a review is reasonable. However, in several instances, the Department of Labor has gone too far. Prohibiting children under 16 from using power-driven machinery, whether self-propelled or not, could restrict their access to nearly all aspects of farming, such as harvesting crops, repair work, or raising animals. Such a ban would be a real burden on farmers who often rely on local youth to fill many jobs. Similarly, broad terminology is used to prohibit work in storage facilities and on construction projects. This would mean silos, but could also mean barns, which are used to store hay or animals. While the intent may be appropriate, in practice it will end up limiting youth employment in historically non-hazardous and educational fields. Together, the DOL's rules are a step back for family farmers and the communities they support. The reality is that farms are unique operations, and with this comes a wide range of tasks that you would not see in a retailer, restaurant, or office. We have to be mindful of these differences and not simply regulate it as we would any other industry. Breaking the intergenerational bond among family farmers and increasing red tape on them is a risky proposition. In the end, it could ultimately result in lower employment in rural areas and even higher food prices across the country. Family-owned farms are a critical part of America, putting dinner on the table but also serving as a linchpin for so many of our communities. As a key provider of jobs and education, they are central to our economy, and we need to give the tools and resources they need to succeed rather than burden them with more red tape. I want to thank all the witnesses for traveling here today, and I look forward to their testimony. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Kretz. If committee members have an opening statement prepared, I'd ask that they submit it for the record. I'd like to take a moment to explain our timing lights for Ms. LePink. You'll have 5 minutes to be able to deliver your testimony. The light will start out as green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow, and finally it will turn red at the end of your 5 minutes. And I'll ask that you try and limit your time, but I will be lenient, of course, to be able to allow you to finish. Our first witness today is Ms. Nancy LePink. She currently serves as Deputy Administrator of DOL's Wage and Hour Division. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Close enough? Okay. Prior to joining the Department of Labor in 2009, she worked for 24 years for the state of Minnesota, working for both the State Attorney General and the State Department of Labor and Industry. Ms. LePink, you may deliver your testimony, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation to testify at this hearing. Mr. Chairman, the Department of Labor recognizes the importance of youth employment and the value of agricultural work, and respects the role of parents in raising their children. We welcome the dialogue with this committee and want to ensure that the views of the agriculture community as a whole are fully considered. This is evidenced by the fact that after receiving a number of comments from stakeholders on the need to provide the Department with further input on the parental exemption, the Department announced yesterday that it would repropose the parental exemption portion of its recent Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Child and Agriculture. Since it was passed in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act has included child labor protections because Congress recognized that when children are employed, they should be employed under conditions that do not put them in harm's way. The agricultural child labor provisions of the FLSA only apply to youth under the age of 16. Moreover, the statute's child labor provisions include a parental exemption that applies to children who are employed by their parents on a family farm that is owned or operated by those parents. One of the highest priorities of the Secretary of Labor has been and continues to be the prevention of the death and injury of children as a result of their employment in hazardous occupations. Children serving as employees in agriculture businesses are among the most vulnerable of our nation's workers. Fatality rate for young agricultural employees is 4 times greater than that of their peers employed in non-agricultural workplaces. The injuries suffered by children employed in agriculture also tend to be more severe. Unfortunately, even with the current laws on the books, there are employers who continue to illegally hire and employ children to work in hazardous jobs in agriculture businesses. Child farm employees are still killed or injured on the job, and one child injured or killed is one too many. It is also not uncommon for the Wage and Hour Division to find young children working illegally in the fields, exposed to numerous hazards, including pesticides and dangerous equipment. In an effort to ensure we protect and keep working children safe while not limiting their opportunities to be employed in positive work experiences, the Department of Labor has for a number of years been reviewing the federal child labor regulations. The current federal agricultural child labor rules were issued over 40 years ago and have never been updated or revised. The hazardous occupation orders that are in the proposed rule only apply to children who are age 15 and younger and serving as employees on a farm not owned by or operated by their parent or person standing in the place of the parent, and only limits them from performing the most hazardous jobs. The Department's proposed rule also only applies to situations where there is an employment relationship. In other words, a child of any age could, for example, assist a neighbor in need to round up loose cattle that have broken out of their fencing, because that would not establish an employment relationship. And even if an employment relationship is established, a child could still help a neighbor with work such as hand harvesting crops, detasseling corn, and many other tasks. Nor would the regulations apply to situations where a child is raising a pig as part of her 4-H project or taking that pig that she's raised to sell at a county fair or market. Most of the proposed rules in the NPRM update the hazardous occupation orders that limit the agricultural employment of youth under the age of 16 unless the parental exemption applies. The NPRM proposes to amend those orders, among other things, prohibit child farm employees who are 15 years old and younger from operating most power-driven equipment, including tractors and other hazardous farm implements. However, a bona fide student learner who is 14 and 15 would still be permitted to operate these types of equipment when they are enrolled in a vocational education program, such as those offered by a state or local educational authority. The proposed rule would not eliminate safety programs that are provided by organizations such as 4-H and the FFA. We fully support the important contributions these organizations make. The proposed rule would also create a new non-agricultural hazardous occupational order that would prohibit employing children under the age of 18 in all work performed in conjunction with storing, marketing, and transporting farm product materials. In the last 2 years, the Department has investigated the deaths or serious injury of 6 young workers in this industry. Under the proposed rule, children 17 years old and younger would be prohibited in non-agricultural employment from working in such establishments as grain elevators, silos, stockyards, and livestock exchanges. The notice and comment for this proposed rule has allowed for significant and robust comments from all of our stakeholders, including many members of Congress. The Department will carefully consider those comments as it develops a final rule. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Ms. LePink. Appreciate your testimony and for appearing here today. And I think that certainly goes without saying. I know from my part of the world, I come from a rural area, ag communities, that we all want to make sure that our children are safe. However, I think that there are some concerns that recognize, and now that there seems to be a repositioning here by DOL in terms of submitting the ruling. You said that it was going to be resubmitted for the parental exemption, and input from agricultural producers played a significant part in this decision. May have a couple of points to this, but what sort of outreach did you do before the proposed rule was coming out? I think one of the great amounts of frustration, which many of us who are not career politicians have, is we see rules and regulations coming out without outreach, and then we feel the impacts. What outreach was done before, and now what's changed so dramatically that now we're listening to the input?
Well, first of all, the whole purpose of a proposed rule and the opportunity for comment, which we extended for an additional 30 days, is in fact to get that input when the actual regulation is out in the public and people know exactly what it is that we're proposing. The whole idea of a notice and comment period is for us to, and we received 10,000 comments on this rule, is for us to be able to take in those comments and consider them and make sure that the rule takes them into consideration when it's become final. So therefore, the whole comment period is, when we propose a rule, it's by no means final. The rule is proposed for the very purpose of engaging the public in what that final rule will be. However, what we did prior to noticing the rule was actually, this rule has been under consideration for a very long period of time. Our GAO report was issued in the late 90s, criticizing the Department for not having looked at these hazardous orders for a very long period of time. So we commissioned a study by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health to help us evaluate how things had changed in agriculture, and what potential changes needed to be made in the hazardous orders. They issued their report in 2002. After that report was issued, we engaged with the farm community, farm employers, advocacy groups, and other academians and medical experts regarding what was put out in that report. And then basically nothing happened for several years. When this administration began, we began to look at that report, because one of the objectives of the administration was to update and to look carefully at those hazardous orders to be certain that they were responsive to what was going on for children when they were working. We updated the non-ag rules and completed that rulemaking in May of 2010. So then when we completed that rulemaking, we began the process of looking at the agricultural hazardous occupations. In that process, we also brought in members of the community, including the National Council of Agricultural Employers and the American Farm Bureau, to engage in a conversation about basically what was in that NIOSH report and the other subsequent feedback that we had received on those recommendations. And so it was with that input and the input of others that we then put out the proposed rule. We extended the notice of comment period additional 30 days because we heard from Congress and others that additional time was important to ensure that all voices were heard.
Okay, thank you. You know, I'd like to point out this article I had from yesterday's Durango Herald, which is in my district. It's one of my local newspapers. In the article, it states that for most farmers, tractors no longer earn their keep. Basically, that over the lifespan of the tractor, the food the tractor nets no longer nets enough money to be able to pay for the tractor before it needs to be replaced. Additionally, several other factors force farmers to have another full-time job. Given these circumstances, folks are becoming more and more reluctant to take up farming as a career. I'm fearful that the provisions in the original proposed rule only exacerbate this situation. Can you provide us with any certainty or a sense of hope that these farmers who are becoming more and more discouraged are going to be able to do something that I noted in my opening comments? Family farming is literally family farming.
I understand that. I grew up in a rural community in Minnesota. My father was a family doc. We moved to that community because of the values that community had. So I understand, you know, what it means to grow up in a small town. What I want to make clear is that what we're not doing today, what we're not talking about today, so that we can make sure that we're focused on what we really are talking about. We're not talking about kids who are 16 years and older who are employed on any farm, whether a family farm or a big corporate farm. We're not talking about farm kids who are working for their parents or a person standing in the place of the parent on a farm operated by that parent but maybe not owned, or a farm owned by that parent, and now, as of the announcement yesterday, a farm substantially owned by that parent, so no longer requiring that it be wholly owned by that parent. We're not talking about neighbors helping neighbors in need. We're not talking about kids participating in 4-H or FFA. We strongly support those programs.
If I could interrupt you just a little bit, when you're talking about in need, in my area we have grandparents, great-grandparents, and the family farm. They may not be adjacent. We have neighbors, and you say in need. I'm not sure what in need actually means. And given the nature, you said you grew up in a rural community. I was bucking bales when I was 12 years old, not effectively because they were 80-pound bales.
For your parents? For your parents?
No, it was actually for another farm.
Okay.
And was out and working.
Okay.
And great experience to be able to not only to be able to earn wages, but to be able to learn a work ethic. My father felt that that was important for me.
Well, first of all, I don't think that what the rule we're proposing would have precluded you from bucking hay. So
I was earning a wage.
I know, but this regulation only focuses on the most hazardous occupations. So even if you are under 16, there are many, many things that you can do on a farm. This does not outright prohibit kids from 15, 14, 13, 12, and younger from working on a farm. It only focuses on those jobs that, based on data, based on our enforcement experience, we have found results in the serious injury or the fatality of children. So bucking hay, I mean, to be honest with you, I haven't ever bucked hay, but maybe you can describe it for me, but if what I understand it, that would not be prohibited by this rule.
Yeah, I did, yeah. Actually, Congressman Kritz pointed out, we had a moving hay wagon in front. And I actually got to drive the tractor at 12
Okay.
As well. And so it's just part of the experience. I guess my point is that understanding, you said you'd reached out to the Farm Bureau. My Farm Bureau has talked to me. They want their children to be able to learn this value. And under the proposed rule of government's here to help, and you've got to be enrolled in a VOTEC program if you're under 15 to be able to participate and be able to work with some of the mechanized equipment. Isn't this a heavy hand of government? We want to be able to, I would submit that our parents and grandparents love those kids. They want to be able to protect them. Do we need the federal government? Do we need OSHA stepping into the workplace of the family farm to be able to deal with that?
Chairman, we have received significant comments on the various, things that you are stating. That is one of the reasons why we made the decision to repropose the parental exemption, because really what you're talking about, the opportunity to work for grandparents and aunts and uncles, is exactly what the parental exemption is what the conversation we're having about the parental exemption is about. And so consequently, one of the reasons that the agency reproposed the parental exemption is so that we would be in a position to address the very issues that you're and concerns that you're raising.
I guess I'd like to move on. I want to make sure
Sure.
we get to our other panel members here as well. But can you explain the discrepancy for me between what the DOL states in its initial rule and what it is currently made publicly available?
Okay. The proposed rule set out what was the current enforcement practice of the agency, which our enforcement records indicate dates back to approximately 2002. The FOH that is on the website is out of date. When this rule was published, we were in a comprehensive revision of that chapter, in part because of outdated provisions like the parental exemption, but also because of the recent amendments to the child labor regulation that went into effect in 2010.
When was that language changed?
When was the language changed? The language in the FOH is out of date. So it hasn't been changed. But the enforcement practice of requiring that the farm be wholly owned began in 2002.
Okay.
At the latest.
Has this been enforced?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we have. I mean, we don't have regular cases on, in terms of family farms. But we have, our enforcement data indicates that as early as 2002, the issue of whether the farm was wholly owned or not for purposes of a citation was an issue.
Would it be possible to get that enforcement data from you?
Yes.
Okay, we would appreciate that. Tell you what, I think what I'd like to do is I'm going to follow up, if you don't mind.
Sure.
With some, I've got a number of questions, and I do want to be able to get to some of our other members here. So I will yield now to Ranking Member Kritz for his questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And for the record, so how do you say your last name?
Leppink.
Leppink. Okay. See, mine's Kritz, and nobody can say it,
Yeah.
so I figured we'd get that out there. Now, yesterday the DOL decided to reopen the parental exemption to the rule. What prompted that?
What prompted it is the abundance of comments that we received, and also, of course, the input from Congress that there are concerns about what was being proposed. We felt that the rule would benefit from being reproposed and revised based on, the input that we had had. Plus, reproposing it allows for us now to engage further with interested parties, and of course, then it will be published and put out for another round of notice and comments. So
Right.
we want to get this right, and so consequently, we felt that that was the best way for us to get it right.
Well, I guess that leads to my next question, which is the current parental exemption standard must be apparently deficient. So what prompted this to be revisited?
Actually, it wasn't revisited. Like
Well,
we
it's being
reproposed it.
changed, so there must be something wrong with the way it's
Well,
structured.
Actually, it wasn't being changed. What we were doing was we were putting out for comment how we had been enforcing the law. What this has allowed for then is for us to get the very input that we've gotten, that that the farm community thinks that definition is no longer in step with how family farms are currently structured. So this is going to if we hadn't put it out there, there would have been no opportunity for the family farm to weigh in on how we were applying that exemption in our enforcement activity. So what this has allowed, though, 10,000 comments later, what that's allowed is for us to do exactly what I think we as an agency should be doing, which is getting it our best shot as to what, based on what we believe is the proper interpretation.
Yeah.
We've given now the opportunity for the public to comment.
Proper interpretation of?
The statute.
Okay.
I mean, I have an obligation as the enforcement agency to apply the laws that are enacted by Congress.
Right.
Parental exemption is a statutory provision.
Yeah.
And so I have then the responsibility of going out and applying it in the real world. And so what that requires is often, we have to interpret what Congress meant by owned and what Congress meant by operated. And so consequently, we indicated in the proposed rulemaking what we believed Congress meant. Now and as a result of the notice of proposed rulemaking, we're hearing that that agriculture has changed in the last 10 years, and that there's a lot of different corporate structures. There's the family farm is not owned and by the operator, that there are reasons, inheritance tax reasons, and all sorts of reasons that family farms have now entered into a variety of business structures. So the opportunity of this rulemaking now has allowed us to then, the rulemaking process as is would have allowed us if we had just simply gone forward, because we've gotten an incredible amount of comments and great comments. But what we're doing now is reproposing it, so we'll, sort of people have yet another chance for us to engage stakeholders and another round of comments based on what I imagine will be a revised proposal when we republish it.
So it's possible that the outcome would be that the parental exemption won't change at all based on comments?
I mean, anything is possible,
right.
But the purpose of reproposing it is because we feel that we have gotten comments that we need to seriously consider, and consequently, the intent is to put out a revised proposal as quickly as we can.
Okay. Just a couple sort of like more detailed kind of things is
Sure.
that the rule applies new prohibitions beginning at age 14, which are traditionally the first 2 years or the beginning of the first 2 years of an agricultural instruction program. So a recent study showed, however, that 36% of first and second year agricultural education students, 36%, were involved in some type of hands-on agricultural placement. So would this new rule prevent that, these types of placements for these 14 and 15-year-olds?
I know actually what the proposed rule does is it actually wants to tightly join both the educational and training, sort of in the classroom, with the on-the-job training that kids would receive. And so the rule is not prohibiting kids from basically, getting the training in addition to working on the job, getting additional training or reinforcing the training that they're receiving in actual work.
Right. So, well, that's what, and that's where I'm trying to get my hands around this. Is that, as the chairman asked about the VOTEC programs, is that, are you changing the definition though of like the different types of ag programs that would make that the young people could work through and make them eligible for this type of thing? Is that where, when you say tightening, that's what I'm trying to figure out what tightening means. Are there multiple programs now out there that wouldn't be eligible for this type of?
There are certain programs that may not meet the requirements that we're proposing. You're correct.
Yeah.
So consequently,
is it, by not being eligible, does that mean that they would have an opportunity to adjust to meet new requirements?
Sure. In fact, we're already in conversations with the Department of Agriculture about how we can work on those educational programs together.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that's driving my concern about some of the things that we're talking about is that, well, I guess I can ask you this question: Have child or farm-related injuries among children, are we seeing an incline? Are we seeing a steady? Are we seeing a decline? I mean, as we're talking about child labor, and as the chairman was talking about, what'd you call it? Not baling hay.
Bucking.
Bucking hay. Yeah, well, bucking bells. Is that, at the age of 12, is that he wasn't on a family farm, but it was part of the culture of where he grew up, this is something that they did. So I'm curious that we're doing all this revisiting, we're doing all this refining, I guess you could say, or tightening of regulations, and I'm curious as to what we've seen in industry. Is this a problem that has been growing?
It's a problem that's been remaining steady. Steady?
Okay. That's because I think we have statistics that show that there's been a sharp decline in farm-related over the last 10 years. So I would disagree with that. Now, I'd be curious to see what your statistics, what you're showing, because ours are, according to the National Children's Center for Rural and Agricultural Health and Safety, the rate of injuries per 1,000 household youth, those living on farms, declined by 48% from 1998 to 2009. Over the 11 years from 98 to 09, the rate of childhood agricultural injuries per 1,000 farms includes youth who live on visit and are hired to work declined by 59% from 16.6 to 6.8.
Okay.
So that's why I'm sort of the mindset, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. And, obviously as time goes on, sometimes we get smarter or we realize that what we're doing could be done better. And certainly I support that.
Well, if I've spoken in error, we can provide the committee with the studies that we were looking at when we promulgated the rule.
Okay.
And sometimes we're talking percents and sometimes we're talking numbers, and I would probably feel more comfortable if we provided you with the data that we were relying on and the data that we have in the agency.
Okay. And you made, I lost it now, but you made a comment that I'm going to probably revisit in a second round. But one last question is, in most cases, the Labor Department cites NIOSH as the reason a particular hazardous occupation order was expanded. However, in the case of working with animals, the Department of Labor decided to ignore NIOSH's recommendation. Can you expand on why that is?
Well, we didn't only rely on the recommendation of the NIOSH report. We also relied on data that was provided by other entities, including medical experts, and we also relied on our own enforcement experience in the proposal for this rule, and so consequently, that is in part what that NIOSH report then has been supplemented by the other additional information that we've acquired and since been provided since the NIOSH report came out in 2002.
Okay. What I was told is that from all the investigations we've done, this is the only time that the NIOSH has not been used as the sole supplier of information. So if you have other places that DOL has used something other than NIOSH's recommendation, we'd certainly love to see it. Or, right, they disagreed with NIOSH. And if this is something that we need to look at that is going to be Department of Labor's standard operating procedure going forward, certainly that's something that we want to weigh in on and play a role in how that plays out. And I know we have some other folks who want to ask questions, so I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Kritz. I'd now like to recognize Congressman Rehberg for questioning. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Kritz, for the opportunity to sit at the dais. I am a fifth-generation Montana rancher. Actually, my great-grandfather was born in Montana in 1873, left home at 9, and started breaking horses at Fort Assiniboine at 11 in a paid capacity, and lived to be 91. So you can, in fact, work as a young man, even back in the 1880s, and survive. I've come to the conclusion in my 11 years in Congress that it isn't necessarily a difference in philosophy between Republicans and Democrats. There's a difference in philosophy between urban and rural. And this is one of those situations where I think the Department of Labor is overstepping its boundaries, its knowledge base, and frankly, I think you're sitting around watching reruns of Blazing Saddles, and that's your interpretation of what goes on in the West, and it isn't anymore. Now, I've taken all the glamour out of my ranching operation because I don't rope, and I don't tie, and I don't brand with a hot iron. I use a self-catching head gate. I use a squeeze that is hydraulic, and I have a calf table. You can't get hurt. It is impossible. You could have a 5-year-old out there running it. I've got kids that are working for me, my son's friends who come out and help with self-starting generators that are run by propane, which under your rule looks like will no longer be able to be used. We have a feedlot operation where we take the kids in the feedlot from the neighboring places, and we pay them to move silage around or shovel manure. If it's a hard and fast rule that they can't work in a feedlot or they can't man a vaccination in a self-catching head gate, then it lacks common sense. I don't get it. Now, Mr. Chairman, I can assure you, as chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, that you haven't seen the last of this. I will have a rider on my appropriations bill that I write for the House of Representatives that will keep you from implementing this rule. It makes no sense. We want a safe work environment for our children and our neighbors' children. Let me ask you a question about herding. I had, when I was elected to Congress, 600 head of cashmere goats. My neighbor, who was the publisher of the largest newspaper in the state of Montana, wanted me to put his 10-year-old son to work. So I put him on a youth motorcycle, little Kawasaki 60, and he herded goats for me on a daily basis. Now, would that be exempt under this rule, or would he not be able to work for me as a 10-year-old riding a youth motorcycle? As I understand it, herding is not allowed. It doesn't say anything about how the herding occurs. And with goats or sheep, it's a constant. I mean, I also had... the
regulation doesn't say that herding is allowed.
It says it's not allowed.
No, the regulation doesn't say that herding is not allowed.
As I read the material, it looked as if jumping on a horse and going out and herding cattle was not going to be allowed for those under 16.
Okay. But you just added an element that could result. I mean,
well, see, this is the problem because the Department of Labor doesn't know agriculture. It's a way of life. It's a lifestyle. And just because a 4-H student or FFA may have a show animal, but it's also how they learn. They might climb under a tractor with their neighbor just to learn the mechanics. And you don't learn this from a book. You don't need to go to a class. You learn it from your neighbors and your friends and your relatives. And you know, I'm just appalled. It really bugs me to read something like this and expect this one-size-fits-all knowledge from Washington, D.C. to try and determine what is appropriate for agriculture within a state like Montana. It just baffles me. So as I had suggested before, Mr. Chairman, we're not done with this. I do get to put the riders on. I know it'll pass the House. I have no idea whether it'll pass the Senate. I'll do everything I possibly can to keep this regulation from ever being implemented as it is written, unless you go back and just spend a lot more time with Farm Union, Farm Bureau, Grange, you name it. I don't care who it is, in the Department of Agriculture to try and come up with some kind of a sensible, reasonable regulation that truly keeps our children safe, while at the same time allows the next generation to take over their family farm or ranch. Thank you.
Congressman Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that there is some opposition to this rule, but I am interested in what I consider to be an important issue, the lives of children. I read with horror about Wyatt Whitebread, the 14-year-old boy in Illinois that suffocated in a grain silo in July 2010. I read with horror the cases of Oklahoma teens Tyler Zander and Bryce Gannon, both 17, who each lost a leg in a grain auger accident this past August. I read about the 100 preventable deaths of youth per year, the estimated 907 youth who died on American farms, and I'm not one to minimize a single preventable death of a young person. So I'd like to ask you how many youth farm workers are killed, injured, and how does agriculture compare to other industries in terms of young people's deaths?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The data that children are significantly more likely to be seriously injured or killed while performing agricultural work than children working in all other industries combined. Studies show that children are significantly more likely to die while performing agricultural work than while performing work in any other industry. These studies also show that the prevalence of children working in agriculture suffer more serious injuries. From 2003 to 2010, 74% of the children under the age of 15, so we're not talking about the kids who were 16 and older who died, but children who were under the age of 15 who died on the job were employed in agriculture. Children ages 15 to 17 working on farms were 4 times more likely to die on the job than those in any other industry. So consequently, agriculture is the most hazardous industry that either adults or children work in. And this regulation is only targeting the very youngest, and we're only targeting those jobs that are the most hazardous. And we are not precluding family farms from hiring their kids to work on their farms. We're not prohibiting parents from employing their child. We're not prohibiting children from doing their chores. We're not prohibiting children from participating in 4-H. What we are talking about is 15, 14, 13, 12, and younger kids working as hired farm workers, often alongside their parents. We're talking about the most hazardous jobs that most frequently injure and kill children. We're talking about one of the most hazardous workplaces that anyone can work, which is a grain elevator or a grain bin. We're talking about Tyler Zander, and we are talking about Bryce Gannon, who lost their legs in a grain bin when they were caught in an auger. That's what we're talking about with this regulation. The youngest of the young that has the most hazard of the hazards.
And could those injuries and deaths been prevented?
The kids, in terms of the regulation related to grain bins, that would not have allowed those children to be in that workplace. So consequently, yes, it would have prevented those injuries.
Some people think that the Department of Labor doesn't have the authority or precedence to issue rulemakings for farm workers, but I believe the Fair Labor Standards Act governs youth workers. How does the department define their authority in that area?
But when the Fair Labor Standards Act was amended in 1966, when the Congress expanded the protections for children in agriculture, Congress required the Secretary to find and declare those jobs that were particularly hazardous for children to perform under the age of 16. So consequently, our authority and our responsibility to promulgate these regulations is in the Act.
And once again, about the vocational programs for certification, how do these rules impact the vocational agricultural programs?
What these rules do is in an effort to, because what the bona fide child student learner provisions of the rules allow is that for children who are participating in those vocational programs at ages 15 and 14 to engage in activities that they would otherwise be prohibited, or jobs that they would otherwise be prohibited from being employed to do. So consequently, what the regs do is that when early on in the first iteration of these regulations, there was not a lot of information about these vocational training programs. So what this proposed rule is intending to do is to articulate standards for training programs whereby there's more assurance that children are receiving the kind of training both in the classroom and on the job that they need to be able to operate, particularly this equipment, hazardous implements, safely.
But it sounds like those programs can continue.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes. In fact, there's nothing that eliminates any program. All it does is establishes criteria for when the training received in those programs can result in an employer taking advantage of that student learner exemption.
Mr. Chair, I have to go to another appointment, but I would like to have unanimous consent to have materials inserted into the hearing record. I have a written statement from the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs and a written statement by the Child Labor Coalition.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Representative Bartlett, do you have some questions?
I was born in 1926, and I grew up during the Depression. Mm-hmm. I've always lived on a farm. As a child, we had only horses on the farm, and then we moved to tractors. I worked as a kid on a farm. My kids worked on the farm. My grandkids work on the farm. I will tell you, there's nobody more concerned about the health and safety of these kids than their parents. There are two basic philosophies as to why we need regulations. One of them is that every provider, every manufacturer, every employer, and in this case, I guess you would include parents, are some combination of evil or greedy or stupid. And if you don't watch them and control them, they're going to take advantage of employees or consumers or children. And then there's a second premise for regulations, and that is that every consumer is incredibly stupid, and they're going to hurt themselves if we don't have a whole lot of regulations to prevent them from doing that. If you think about all the regulations that we have, they are formulated in response to one or both of those fundamental philosophies, which I reject, and I think the average American rejects those philosophies. If you want to be useful, please educate. I had a fire on my farm, and some bureaucrat came and put a big thing on the door, it's safe, you can't go in. Don't tell me I can't go in my building. Tell me you don't think it's safe for me to go in my building. I'm not an idiot. I'll be happy to have your education, but don't tell me what I can do in my building. I just have a fundamental problem with most of our regulations. I don't want you to modify this regulation. I want you to withdraw the regulation. If you can't find useful things to do in educating our parents, then find something else to do, because I think what you're doing now is not a useful pursuit at all. Now, two of our kids, one of them now is a PhD, and the other one is a very successful builder. When they were little kids, and Carol Bertner wanted somebody to pick his corn. He couldn't find any city kids to do that because they were watching television and doing drugs and smoking and whatever else. Our kids were out there in the morning at sunup, going through these fields picking corn with long sleeves on because you get the blades will cut your arms. Yep. They came in soaking wet from that. Mm-hmm. Long before your age of 14, they were lifting bales. Our bales aren't 80 pounds, so they could lift them by 40, 50 pounds, so the bales that we make with the kicker balers and so forth. And they were proud that some of the city kids that came to do this work couldn't do it in the heat of the summer. You know, farming is a whole different thing. I've lived on a farm all my life. I don't know why you're meddling here. You know, there's not a problem. You can find some anecdotal things. But, you know, as the old farmer says, the juice ought to be worth the squeezing. What you're doing here, the juice sure ain't going to be worth the squeezing. You know, can't you find something more productive to do than hassle our farmers?
I'd like to think that I'm protecting children.
You know, I will tell you that the parents are more interested in protecting children than you are. Why don't you just use your time educating so that they know the proper procedures and so forth?
Congressman, we do spend a significant amount of time providing educational assistance. Also, many of the things that you described, this regulation would not prohibit, certainly will not prohibit any work that you did on your parents' farm. It would not prohibit the kids from picking the corn. It would not prohibit the kids from bucking the hay. Like I said earlier, it only limits the most hazardous work that kids can do.
You don't think parents want to do that same thing?
Well, where this regulation it has no impact on parents parenting their children.
How old does a child have to be before they can drive a tractor?
On their parents' farm?
Yeah.
0.
Okay.
They can drive the tractor on their parents' farm at any
My
age.
time is running out. I just have a real problem with our regulations, you know. We're struggling. Every 6 hours is another $1 billion debt. We're struggling with huge problems, and you're doing this? I just don't get it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. King?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witness for coming here to testify. I don't think I would want to do that.
Right.
But we all think about this from the perspective of our backgrounds, and
Sure.
There's a strong culture in America in agriculture, and I grew up in rural communities and rural areas, out in the country, and we only had 25 acres, and that was all timber. So I could go out and either cut trees and do that and fix fence, which we did, or I could work for the neighbors. It was a good thing for me to go out when I was very young, and I was very proud to be able to go next door and pick up a $5 bill for a day's work. And I learned how to work, and I remember that the first time I was put on machinery, it was for 75 cents an hour. I probably wasn't worth that, but I learned something about machinery, and today we have a second-generation construction company that's heavy equipment that runs in multiple states that grew out of that training that I received when the only opportunity I had was to go to work for the neighbors. And now I see that we have, and some of this is going to be not specific to the rules you're proposing here, but the anomalies that come from the expansion of the nanny state, this aggressive expansion of the nanny state, which is what I think Mr. Bartlett has addressed. And I think in terms of this, this is during the previous administration when the Department of Labor came into my district to examine some youth that were working in a convenience store. And they went and interviewed them in their households, and they said, have you ever worked after 7 o'clock on a school night? Well, 2 of them said yes one night. Well, that's 2 violations. Have you ever operated the pizza dough maker? Well, no, but I washed it once. Well, there's another violation because the rule says operate or otherwise use. And the interpretation of the Department of Labor was that washing the tool in the pizza dough maker was otherwise using it. And now, so I look at this and I think, what are we teaching our youth? Where do they learn their work ethic if we are going to ban them from working on a school night past 7 o'clock, ban them from washing the pizza dough maker, ban them from running the lawnmower up until they're the age 18, but give them a driver's license so they have the ability to go 120 mile an hour and turn the radio up full blast? I mean, there's not a, and I know that isn't your rule to address this, but
well, no, but the 120 miles an hour.
they have the ability to.
Well, yeah, but it's not.
Yeah, I know there's a rule, but you don't really come here to propose to us that the rules are always followed. So I think you'd recognize that people sometimes violate them, but I just bring you back to this that is part of the rules that are in front of us, and that is that when I look at prohibits them from herding livestock in a confinement, that means that a 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old waiting for their 16th birthday can't step into a hog confinement and help sort pigs that are older than 6 months old. Even with an adult there to supervise them who has been presumably authorized by the parents, who are those who have the most vested in the protection of their children. Can't do so on horseback. Can they ride a horse? And if there's another horse next to them, is that herding? Will that be the interpretation that comes, kind of like washing a pizza dough maker is operate or otherwise use? I just think this is completely outrageous to move down this path. But the real question I originally came as I listened to you talk is this, that you said that agriculture is the most dangerous and the injuries to youth are significantly greater there than any other occupation. So what is the second greatest danger for youth in an occupation? If agriculture is first, what's the second?
Congressman, I don't know. I can get you the answer to that.
I mean, I would just find that very curious that
Sure.
if you looked at the data...
I would speculate maybe construction, but I don't know for sure.
But if we're looking at data and we're driven by data, hopefully we're not driven just by anecdotes, but driven by data.
Very
if the data says agriculture and we don't know what's the second most dangerous, let me pose this other piece.
Well, I mean, people know. I just don't happen to have...
Yeah, I understand, but you're our expert witness. And so and I don't mean that to mean it derogatorily. I just think that a professional curiosity would want to look at the full list of that and have an understanding of what that data means. And if you only know, you're ready to prepare to testify about one component of all that data, then probably the proportionality of it isn't been internalized professionally. And that's curious to me that could be the case. I'm not saying would be the case, but I'm just going to pose this then, that we've banned kids from working in every other profession that I can think of except agriculture. And so the only place that's really left for them to work that I know of is agriculture because of the exemptions that are there. So wouldn't it be that if the only place kids were really working in reasonable numbers is agriculture, if that's where the injuries are, yeah, that's kind of a no-brainer to figure that out. And if we ban kids from working in agriculture, yes, injuries will go down. But what we're doing is we're shutting down the ability of generations to learn a work ethic, to learn a skill, and to learn safety. And I think about my kids that I brought them into our construction business at age 9. And their first job was take the corn knife and cut the weeds growing around the grade stakes so the operators could see them from the machine. I quickly learned that the safest place for them was on the machine, not on the ground, and we made safety adjustments along the way as I got older and got skills. But the neighbor kids didn't have that opportunity. If they didn't have a dad that had a business, if they didn't have a neighbor that had a farm, and these opportunities are being taken away. And many things about America's work ethic are being diminished by the nanny state, and this is one of them. And I feel badly that you're charged with coming here today to make the case that I just believe is not very strong, and I appreciate you doing that, but I wanted to express myself and give you an opportunity to say whatever you might.
I mean, Congressman, we have received many comments with some of the substantive parts of the issues that you've raised, particularly with regard to herding cattle, herding animals. And so, that is part of the rulemaking process for folks like yourself to weigh in on that maybe we got it wrong. And so consequently, that's why we put these rules out for the very people like you to be able to express your concerns, and also for you to give us your perspective, so that when the final rule comes out, and there's many examples of rules being changed as a result of this very process, and so therefore I want you to know that I know that we've received similar comments, and we are taking very seriously those comments, and they will be reflected in the final rule.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Mr. Schilling?
Thank you, Chairman. Just quickly, and sorry, I apologize for being late today. But I have to agree with what I heard on the tail end of this with Mr. King. I also am a small business owner, and one of the things I did is I was fortunate enough to where I could bring my kids in at 8 years old, 9 years old, and teach them some good, solid work ethic. And I think one of the things we've got to, number one, is we've got to keep our kids safe. We totally understand that, and we want that to happen. And I think the farmers want to keep their kids safe also. So, but one of the things that I'm concerned of is so many times the government comes in to I don't know, as Mr. King put it, is like a nanny state. And I think overall the intentions are good, but the effects that it has long term for our work ethic as a nation and how it's going to adversely affect our small businesses, farms, and other businesses outside the ma and pa shops that are out there, the ones that are pretty much the backbone of the United States of America. I think it's something that we need to really make sure that as you're having people write in, that we're really careful and we read through and really look at both sides rather than just being reactionary. We understand that you want to be on the offense on this also, but a lot of times we do reactionary things quickly and it has some very, very bad consequences that come that hurt our economy, which, as everybody in this room would understand, with 15, 16% unemployment rate, when you count everybody that's quit looking for work, now's not the time to do that. But at the same time, keeping our kids safe. So that's the comment that I'd like to make. But thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Congressman.
Yield back.
Thank you. And I just have a few more questions, and I think Congressman Kritz does as well.
Sure.
Would like to follow up a little bit on some of your earlier comments there in regards to the field operating manual, and when you stated that it was wrong. When did DOL update it, and when was the record of those updates?
Well, the department has been in the process of doing a comprehensive update of the child labor chapter that was driven by a variety of both regulatory and statutory changes and interpretations. I mean, one was the passage of the GINA law that increased the penalties that the Wage and Hour Division is to issue in certain kinds of situations where children are killed and injured. We were also updating them for purposes of the 2010 amendments to the non-ag child labor. But that chapter had not been updated in many years. And so consequently, it's very difficult to keep. The FOH, first of all, is an internal field operations handbook. Its primary purpose is to guide my field in their enforcement of the law. So consequently, however, every time the law changes, every time a court decision comes down, every time a regulation changes, there's a need to update those FOH chapters. There are many of them, and they cover, my agency enforces 7 major statutes. So as a consequence, we are continuously in an updating or a need to update the FOH, the Field Operations Handbook. So as a consequence, sometimes those updates are delayed. However, the FOH is primarily on the website because we get frequent FOIA requests for the public portions of that document. And so in order to expedite the public's access to that frequently requested information, we simply put it up on the website so that we can simply direct people to the website as opposed to having them go through a FOIA process to get that information. So consequently, we're always in a balancing game of, do we make the information available even though all of it might not be up to date? So for example, the FOH that's up on the website now does not have any reference to the May 2010 amendments to the child labor regulations because we were in the process of updating the entire chapter in addition to add those in addition to many other changes. So consequently, this is a continuous process that we're engaged in.
So we've almost got a situation to where The people are hearing one thing, the enforcement's doing something else, and there isn't great coordination going on.
Well, the agency has significant guidance that is actually the guidance that we direct the public to in the form of fact sheets and field assistant bulletins and interpretations and opinion letters that are the formal interpretations of the agency that we, and regs, regulations, and of course the statute, are the prime sources for people to know what the law requires. As I said, the Field Operations Handbook is primarily written to guide my field. So, but policies change, laws change, regulations change, and I have done my best since I've started to proactively get those chapters that are out of date, that languished prior to 2009 and were not updated. I have been working as hard as I can to get those chapters updated because I know the importance of that information, being current to the extent that the public would look to that document for guidance.
Yeah. I am curious, and it actually comes from some of the comments that have been made here. Does your agency, do you think congressional intent is important?
Absolutely.
In terms of doing that? Given that, the NPRM states that one of DOL's goals is to promote parity between agriculture and non-agricultural exemptions. Can you tell me where in the originating statute or any subsequent amendments that have been made where Congress indicated that it wanted such parity?
I think the conversation about parity comes from the idea that that agricultural kids should be similarly, or workers and employees, agricultural farm worker employees should have similar protections as children who are employed in any other industry. So consequently, when the Congress made clear that we weren't going to give similar protections based on age to children who were employed in agriculture, because for kids who are employed in agriculture, the cutoff, any kid over the age of 16 can be employed to do anything. Okay. But Congress, in the amendments in 1966, made clear that it was its expectation that the Secretary of Labor would identify those that work that was particularly hazardous for children in agriculture to perform. Therefore, we can talk about, I guess, we don't necessarily, it's not a mandate of parity, but the idea being that when we're updating these regulations, we should be looking at the hazard as a hazard. And if it's too dangerous for a child to perform, it doesn't really matter whether it's in agriculture or in another industry if it results in the same risk to that child of serious injury or death.
That begs the question, why weren't the enforcement actions and actions on enforcement disclosed in the rule? What's going to be the fine? Who's going to enforce it? How much is it going to cost?
Well, actually, we have a portion of the chapter that does discuss the imposition of civil penalties. And again, that was an effort to make transparent and to allow for comment on how the agency is would be issuing civil penalties. And so, regulations are really there to implement and interpret the law. And so consequently, that's what's, put in a proposed rule. So I guess I'm not understanding that maybe you could repeat your question.
Well, I'll tell you, I guess because I want to be able to move on and be
Sure.
respectful of your time and our other panel as well. I guess one thing that greatly concerns me is you keep talking about the family farm.
Right.
But you ignored, in my opening statement, we've got great-grandma and grandpa's farm, grandparents' farm, our best friend's farm down the road, to be able to get them involved and for those children to actually to be able to get to work. So is this government trying to micromanage what has been a traditional method of neighbors working with neighbors, family members working with family members, and you're going to define what a family unit is and limit it to that?
Well, the statutory, Congress enacted, and there's a lot of legislative history that talks about, how this new regulation or this new statute was going to protect children, and taking into consideration as expressed in the congressional history, the family farm. The way it's articulated in the legislative history, the purpose of the parental exemption, which is the language. This is not regulatory language. This is statutory language, which is that a child employed by their parent on a farm owned or operated by their parent was, based on the legislative history, the effort of Congress to acknowledge the family farm and the opportunity for children to work on their family's farm. So what the Department of Labor is doing its best is to apply that statute, and of course, and the intent, as we understand it, of Congress, that parents were perceived, which I would absolutely agree, I'm a parent, are naturally in a position to look after the welfare of their children, and therefore the law should not go there to impinge on the ability of that parent to make good decisions on the behalf of their child. So now the task for the Department of Labor is to discern how best to implement the intent of Congress.
Okay, just kind of an opinion. I think that we ought to empower those parents as well to say they can go and pick corn.
Okay, and we're, Congressman, this is another area, as you know, because we're reproposing the rule, where the agency has received significant comments. The idea of reproposing the rule was to be able to be certain that we can take full consideration of just the concerns that you just raised.
Okay. Congressman King, thank you.
I thank the Chairman for recognizing me. I just want a brief question that
Sure.
I'd like to ask, and as I understand that you do speak for the Secretary of Labor, but has the Department of Labor consulted with the Department of Agriculture, and does the Secretary of Agriculture advocate also for these rules changes?
I can't speak for the Secretary of Agriculture. I mean, his statement is in the press release regarding his concern about ensuring the safety of children who are employed, as hired farm workers in agriculture. He's also made the commitment, and so has my secretary, that the two agencies will work together when this part of the rule is reproposed, and of course, in the part of the rule that is going forward, but with comments considered. And so consequently, we have been working for probably over a year with the Department of Agriculture on the policy discussions related to this.
So he has been weighing in, and judging from the public statements that he has made, that the Secretary of Agriculture is working in cooperation with the Secretary of Labor and advocacy for these rules.
What I can say is that the Department of Labor is working with the Department of Agriculture on these rules. We will be working with them on the reproposed parental exemption also. And so both agencies are fully engaged, and we are working together.
I won't press you further. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you're about off the hook here, so I do want to yield to Congressman Critz for the last series of questions on this.
And just in case you didn't see, Punxsutawney Phil did see his shadow, so there's 6 more weeks of winter. So just to
winter
lighten
hasn't
it.
been so bad.
No,
so I guess we can't complain.
So just as a point of clarity, when you said reproposing the rule, it's only the parental exemption rule.
Right.
It's nothing else in this.
The reproposal is
It's just the parental exemption.
Right.
Okay. Just one final question, and to give you some background, I used to work in the district for a member, so part of my job was usually trying to figure out what was going on down here and what it was going to mean to the constituent in the field. And one place where I have concerns because it's all based on interpretation, is that in the Federal Register and the proposed rule, it says the Department's broad proposal to prohibit hired farm workers under the age of 16 from operating or tending any power-driven machinery. Power-driven, equipment operated by any source of energy, such as wind, electricity, fossil fuels, batteries, animals, or water, would all be considered power-driven under this Ag Hazardous Occupation Order, as would any farm implement powered or pulled by an animal, a tractor, or any other power-driven equipment. That's pretty broad.
Right.
Is that a wheelbarrow?
No.
Are we sure?
We will make that clear when.
And that's where
Yeah,
I mean, because interpretation can be very broad, it can be very narrow, and
So-
your interpretation could be
Well-
extremely different from what someone else's interpretation is of this.
We have received many comments on just that part of the rule. We recognize, it's always good, to have 10,000 hypotheticals to help you, sort of make sure that what you're doing is clear. So consequently, and I've heard about the flashlights and the battery-operated screwdrivers, and so believe me, we will be addressing those issues that have been raised in the comments, so that there will not be that confusion.
Good. Just two more things. In Pennsylvania, there's a lot of Amish.
Yes.
The farming's done on communal land where the parents may not actually own the farm. While there is a religious exception in federal law for the Amish, it only pertains to the schooling hours requirement. Given the critical role that farming plays in these communities, did the Labor consider any further exemptions?
The proposed rule does not include any further exemptions for the Amish. I have to say that I don't know whether we got any comments on that, so that would be then an issue as to whether, if we did, whether that would be in the scope of the rulemaking. So I can be happy to have my staff let you know whether we received any comments. I mean, all the comments are public and posted on the website,
Right.
but there's 10,000 of them, so
Right.
I'd be happy to make sure that my staff provides you with any information that we got related to application to Amish
Okay.
workers.
Well, and we actually have representation in the audience from the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau.
Okay, so then
certainly
maybe
we
they can help you.
Yeah, we can make sure that if they haven't had an opportunity or didn't even know what was going on, that they're made aware. And I think the final, just closing comment is that I think we've heard it from up here, and we're probably going to hear it from the panel as well, that farming, family farming, is a different animal than traditional businesses that are run. And the interesting part about farming is, as the statistics I cited, is that safety has been increasing exponentially over the last 10, 12 years. And one thing that I think is interesting as well is that the education level of family farmers and farmers, at least that I know across Pennsylvania, has increased dramatically. So I think what we know is that these are their children, and I can't imagine. Obviously, there's going to be negligence at some point, and my hope is that we're not creating a rule or defining a rule because of one or two bad actors that now inhibits the rest of everyone else who's following the rules. And really, that would be my closing comment. So I really appreciate you coming in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and I interpret what I'm allowed to do to extend it actually just a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Congressman Schilling had another question.
Thank you, Chairman. And Mark brought up a pretty good point. My cousin had a 2,000-acre farm that, as kids, we used to go there all the time. Would this also include recreational vehicles of the farm family, like, for example, snowmobiles or mini bikes? Are they not going to be able to allow the farm kids to ride those? Those are motorized vehicles. Is that something that's going to have? It's kind of, to me, this is very frustrating because it's more of the unintended consequences that the government puts forth. And is this something that's going to be clarified also, ma'am?
Yes, this is a proposed rule. We, to the extent, I mean, first of all, again, kids can do any work for their parents. So, at any age, any job, any time, they can work for their parents. So consequently, though, Yes, we have received comments on that. Where I am cognizant of that, I can assure you as the head of the agency that we will fully consider all of the things that have brought up today regarding concerns, confusions, the issues that have been raised regarding the scope of the parental exemption. Every single one of them will have my personal attention to ensure that we are thinking through the issues that this committee has raised.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Schilling. And I think the last thing I'd like to encourage you to do, you keep focusing on the family farm.
Yes.
You've got to understand the ag community is a different world than downtown Washington, D.C. When we talk about, again, the grandparents, the neighbors that are there. And I think we're all going to be monitoring this, and we will certainly appreciate any updates from you. The committee may have some additional questions regarding this matter, so we may reach out to you with those and would appreciate your response. And again, I'd like to thank you for taking your time, Ms. Leppick, to be here with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
This portion of the hearing is now closed. We'll now continue with our second panel, and I'd like to take a moment for our panelists to be able to explain the timing lights. Each witness will have 5 minutes to be able to deliver your testimony. The light will start out as green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow. And finally, it will turn red at the end of your 5 minutes. And I'd ask that you try and keep it in that time limit. But I will certainly be respectful of you in terms of letting you wrap up a comment. So I'd like to introduce our first panelist here in our second panel, Chris Chin of Chin Hog Farms in Clarence, Missouri. She and her husband operate Chin Hog Farm located in Clarence, Missouri. Chris and her husband are fifth-generation agricultural producers, and they currently operate a diversified operation that includes raising crops and livestock. She's testifying today on behalf of the American Farm Bureau Federation and will be able to provide an agricultural producer's perspective on the effect of these rules on family-owned small business farms. Ms. Chin, thank you for appearing today, and you may now deliver your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to share my comments on the Department of Labor's proposed regulation and how it will affect farm families. As you said, I'm also here today on behalf of the American Farm Bureau Federation, the nation's largest general farm organization. Last December, Farm Bureau and over 70 other agricultural organizations filed extensive comments in opposition to the Labor Department proposal. I would like to ask that those comments be included in the hearing record. My husband Kevin and I are fifth-generation farmers, and we're the proud parents of two terrific kids, Rochelle, who's 14, and Connor, who's 10. Both of our children work on our family farm on a daily basis, just like Kevin and I did when we were growing up. It's a way of life in rural America, but it's more than that. It's a way for us to instill important values in our children, having the right work ethic, earning your keep, recognizing that if you set your mind to something, you can accomplish almost anything, that effort and reward are related, and above all, to be careful when the job that you're doing entails risk. In addition to the chores that our kids do on our farm, both our kids help their grandma and grandpa on their farm. Connor collects eggs from the hens for which Grandma pays him for, and he also helps her clean out the chicken house. Rochelle helps Grandma in the breeding barn with our sows, and she helps breed those animals. She also uses the power washer in the hallways to help clean the hog barn. Their childhood is a lot like mine was, except I didn't get to grow up on a family farm. I spent lots of weekends in the summertime and days through the summer helping my grandparents on their family farm. I started driving a tractor when I was 12 years old. I milked the cows, I collected the eggs, I fed the livestock, I even cut weeds out of the bean field, and I also bucked hay bales. That was part of growing up on the farm, and I can honestly tell you that I would not trade it for anything in the world. But nearly every one of the tasks that I did as a teenager would be prohibited by the new proposed hazardous occupation order. Driving tractors is forbidden by H.O. number 1. Milking a cow is prohibited by H.O. number 4. Cutting weeds would be banned by H.O. number 3. And building or repairing a fence would be banned by H.O. number 6. I know that some people are saying that these regulations will not affect farm families, but I urge the members of this committee to read the actual proposal. Yesterday, the department said they would repropose the parental exemption part of the rule. That's positive. But until we know exactly what they intend to do, I think farmers and ranchers in agriculture are going to continue to be worried. To know why, you just need to look at that original proposal. The Department said that once ownership of a farm is shared with persons other than or in addition to the parent, the exemption does not apply. The proposed regulation also said that a child had to actually live with a relative for possibly 3 months to be exempt, and that a period of less than 1 month would not be sufficient for the parental exemption to apply. It also stated that a child who is exempt from the Ag HOs when employed on his or her parent's farm would generally lose that exempt status when employed on a farm owned or operated by a neighbor or a non-parental relative, such as a grandparent, aunt, or uncle. When farm and ranch families tell you they feel threatened by these regulations, I hope you can understand why. I don't know how anyone can say that the Department of Labor is not fundamentally changing how they're going to enforce the law. The parental exemption is a critical part of this debate, but it's not the only part. For instance, the Department wants to say that no youth under the age of 16 can work with any equipment that is operated by any power source other than human hand or foot power. That would eliminate a lot of equipment, including flashlights and garden hoses, which is not particularly hazardous. I don't think for 1 minute that Congress gave them that authority, and I certainly hope that you won't now. People like Kevin and I, we don't need people in Washington, D.C. telling us what our children can and cannot do on our family farm. We're pretty good at doing that ourselves. Our children are never allowed to go near our bulls or the grain augers. They're not allowed to be around a tractor that's mowing hay unless they're inside that tractor in a buddy seat with a seatbelt on. They're not allowed to go near our feed mill mixer. They're not allowed to mow grass on hills or near buildings. And they're not allowed to power wash inside of a farrowing room yet. I would also like to mention that my 14-year-old daughter, Rochelle, has been to the emergency room 3 times this year. Not one of these injuries was a result of something that happened on our family farm. Instead, they were school-related sports injuries. Never have my children been hurt on our family farm, and never had they been able to, or had a need to have to go to the emergency room because of something that happened on our farm. But my daughter, Rochelle, has went to the ER 3 times this year because of something that happened at school. There's an overwhelming feeling in the agriculture community that the whole proposal is fundamentally flawed. While we're pleased about yesterday's decision to repropose the parental exemption, I think most of us in agriculture feel that it would have been much better had the department withdrawn the entire rule. I would like to thank Congressman Rehberg for his leadership on this issue, and to each of you on this committee who signed on to his letter last year. Thank you for allowing me the time to testify today and for allowing me to share my story with you. I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Chin. Our next witness is Kent Sheshke. He is Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Future Farmers of America. Kent has worked with the National FFA organization since 1991 and has served in his current position since 2009. As a youth, he participated in FFA programs and is here to testify regarding the effect of DOL rules on youth agricultural education, vocational training programs. Kent, if you'd like to go ahead and deliver your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Tipton and members of the subcommittee for allowing me to be here to speak. As was shared in my introduction, I am a product of FFA. I've worked 14 years in Missouri as an agriculture instructor, and I've had the privilege for the last 20-plus years to work for the National FFA. We're here really today to talk about the impact of this, and it's been alluded to in some of the comments that were made in the opening, as well as the impact of this on agricultural education programs that are school-based programs, and we think that there's some issues that need to be addressed in that. Give you a little bit of background today. We have about 7,500 agricultural education programs across the United States. These programs are run by about 11,000 professionally trained teachers, meaning these are teachers who have degrees in agriculture certification to teach, hired by the local school district to be agricultural education instructors. We have enrollment today of about nearly 800,000 students, high school students, in these programs across the country. We have an FFA membership today of 540,000, which really represents an all-time high membership for our organization. Agriculture education in our public schools has been around for almost 100 years. The Smith-Hughes Act in 1917 really created these programs. And today, while the focus of agriculture has changed, our programs today really focus on the science and the business of technology of agriculture and helping young people prepare for careers in agriculture. When it started, the primary focus was, again, this dates it, but young boys involved in agriculture. It wasn't until 1969 that we actually recognized young women and brought them into it, but really preparing young people for careers in agriculture. The other interesting statistic is that 2/3 of the students we serve today come from non-farm backgrounds. These are students who live in rural America, who are interested in agriculture, or students who live in urban and suburban communities. We feel this is important that we give them the experiential learning experiences that go along with agriculture, as we alluded to earlier in the comments. Our program's got really 3 components, and in my testimony I've presented a diagram that kind of illustrates that. For students to be members of FFA, they have to be enrolled in an agricultural education program. That's somewhat unique. It's not just a club that they walk off the street and join. It is tied to this instructional program. In these programs, this is where they learn the science, business, technology, and there's also a heavy emphasis on safety and safety education because of the career preparation part and helping people understand some of the hazards that are in agriculture and how, by expanding their knowledge and their understanding of it and the practices, that they can work safely. The second part of the program is what we call experiential learning, or supervised agriculture experience. And again, it's an opportunity for students to take what they learned in the classroom and put it to application in a workplace setting. And that was alluded to in the earlier discussion. That experience is very important for young people as they prepare for agriculture because they're able to learn the science, the business, the theory, but the contextual hands-on learning is a part of it. A part of our motto, and actually the FFA motto, is learning to do, doing to learn, earning to live, and living to serve. And that learning to do and doing to learn is an important part of what we believe and what is core to our program. The third circle is really the FFA organization. We provide a lot of rewards, recognition, motivation for those young people to take not only what they've learned in the classroom, but also through the experiential learning programs and help them see how they can utilize that in their career aspirations, whether that's to continue into production agriculture or to work in many of the related areas. And for even students who are going into non-farm agriculture-related careers, that agricultural knowledge that they gain through the firsthand experience of working in production agriculture is a very important experience for them. Probably some of our concerns about the proposed rule is really the role of the student learner exemption. And I would call to your attention the side-by-side comparison that exists on the Department of Labor's site that looks at the current and the proposed. And in there it states that in the existing current rule, the student learner exemption kind of runs across all of the defined hazardous occupation areas. In the proposed rule, it is limited to only the first 2. And at the same time, they've taken it from what was 6 areas and expanded that to 14. So in our opinion, at least our definition of the rule is that they have severely limited the opportunities for students who are enrolled in these agricultural education programs to benefit from this experience by drawing it down to just 2 areas from now what is in the proposed rules 14 different hazardous occupation areas. And that's an area that we have a concern with, and we hope that's an area that the Department of Labor in its continued work on this continues to look at. In fact, we would have liked to have seen that one as well opened up in this parental exemption piece because we think there's as much work that maybe needs to be defined in that process as well. And I want to stop here and say that our teachers, their responsibility in this is to provide the supervision, to work with the employers, to work with the parents, and to come up with training programs that reflect the scope of the work that the students are to do, as well as make sure that it's done safely. Our teachers care about the safety of their students. They're very committed to making sure that they maintain that safe working and make sure that our students benefit from the experience. Thank you, and I entertain any questions.
Thank you so much. Our next witness is Bob Tabb. He is Deputy Commissioner of the West Virginia State Department of Agriculture. Bob grew up on a dairy farm and has been involved in production agriculture his whole life. He is testifying today on behalf of his boss, the elected commissioner for the West Virginia Department of Agriculture, Gus Douglas. Mr. Tabb, you may now deliver your testimony, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Tipton, Ranking Member Kritz, and other members of the subcommittee for inviting us to participate in one of the most important situations to affect agriculture for the future of this country. And it's about agriculture and young people. I am Bob Tabb, and I'm Deputy Commissioner of Agriculture for the longest-serving commissioner in the country. Gus Douglas is on his 44th year as the Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of West Virginia. And in West Virginia, the Commissioner of Agriculture is a constitutional officer. So he's elected by the people and to represent the people, and that's why I'm here today, because we're representing the people of West Virginia, along with NASDA, which is an organization we belong to of all 50 states and 4 territories. I grew up on a dairy farm in Jefferson County, West Virginia, which is about 60 miles west of here. And having been from a dairy background, the one thing I'll share with the members today, this year, dairy farmers get to do one thing they don't normally get to do. It's a leap year, so they get to milk the cows 2 extra times this year. And the point of that is agriculture is commitment. It's not just an occupation, it is a way of life. And that's the part that I think some people don't seem to understand, the effect that these type of rule changes can have on an industry so critical to this country. West Virginia has over 23,000 small farms, and statistically, a little bit higher ownership than the state of Pennsylvania. West Virginia actually has the highest percent in the country of owner-operated farms, a lot of small operations. In West Virginia and across this country, and this is a quote from Secretary Vilsack last month at a briefing I was at here in D.C., but he said the average age of the American farmer is nearing 60 years old. And a lot of this focuses on the family farm and the children. But for me to do the math, when the average farmer is approaching 60 years old, that tells me there's getting to be less and less children under 16 that their parents are actually farming. So that increases the need not only to allow nieces and nephews and grandchildren and grandnieces and nephews, but of other youth in the community. As this population ages, they need help. And they care about their operations. The one thing that hasn't been brought out here today is liability. If these children are negligently injured or killed on a farm, there's a price to pay. And there's no price to put on a child's life. But if they do serious violations, they've got penalties to pay. And the farmers that I know are not prone to go out there and just shamelessly put people in harm's way. I don't care whether it's their child. In fact, I'm a grandparent. And I let my kids do things on the farm that I won't let my grandkids do. So I think if you want the next level of child protection, if you put the grandparents in charge of them, there's a few things they might not get to do. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health has made 14 recommendations. And although the Department of Agriculture is in agreement with some issues about instances of when you can and can't use a cell phone, working with anhydrous ammonia, some of these confined spaces with limitations. There's some things that can be done, but they need to be done in a reasonable manner. The proposed change to and this is a quote from the proposed rule change to employment in agriculture under adverse conditions states in part, the Department is asking for comments on whether it should create a new Ag HO addressing youth exposure to extreme temperatures. Such an Ag HO could provide that youth under the age of 16 would not be permitted to work in agriculture occupations where the temperatures at which they are working exceed or drop below a certain temperature, factoring in such things as humidity, wind velocity, and the degree of duration of physical exertion required by the work. It might also require that hours in direct sunlight be limited if the temperature reaches certain thresholds for prolonged periods of time. Anyone who has ever farmed understands weather is the most unpredictable part of farming. To comply with this proposed rule change would most likely require one of two options. Hire a full-time meteorologist to document all the requirements and advise when youth under 16 could work, or secondly, just simply limit farming if you rely on youth under 16 to stack hay, pick fruits or vegetables, feed or work with livestock, or just pull weeds, because it does get hot and it does get cold on a farm. Studies that over the 11-year period from 1998 to 2009, I know I'm about to run out of time, but I appreciate your involvement of the 2011 fact sheet on childhood agricultural injuries, and I would certainly be glad to answer any questions you may have relating to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Tabb. And I'd now like to yield to Ranking Member Kritz so that he may introduce the minority's witness.
Rick Ebert is the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau's Vice President, a position he's held since 2004. Mr. Ebert, in partnership with his brother, operates a dairy farm where he milks 80 Holsteins and farms corn, alfalfa hay, barley, soybeans, and wheat on 450 acres. He was the 1983 recipient of the Westmoreland County Conservation Award and won the Charles E. Cohen Memorial Award presented to the dairyman who has demonstrated superior management capabilities and provided outstanding leadership qualities within the industry. Rick, go ahead.
Thank you. Chairman Tipton, Ranking Member Kritz, and members of the committee, I want to thank you for allowing me to speak at this hearing. I appear before you today not only as a farmer, but also as a parent. And I want to recognize my wife, who's here with me today, with the same concerns as parents who have kids on the farm. We've raised 4 wonderful children on the farm that are highly productive, respectable kids out in the community right now. I must admit, yesterday's announcement by DOL regarding parental exemption was good news to the farming community, but the decision does not help American farmers. It only makes their current proposed rule hurt a little bit less. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that farmers are still concerned with what DOL might repropose. DOL must take great care in considering any changes to the parental exemption. My farm is a partnership. DOL should not reserve the right to tell operators of a farm like mine that they cannot hire their children, nieces, nephews, or grandchildren to help during the summer months. My children help bottle feed calves. This involves direct contact with an animal. There is little or any risk at all in helping feed calves. Anybody here that has children, calves to my children are the same as anybody else's children getting a new puppy or a new kitten. It's the same idea for them. They enjoy doing it. It's a pleasure. There's hardly any risk involved. Whether jobs involve animals or not, I am constantly mindful of each of the child's abilities and the task at hand. I match the child's ability to the task that they can complete. DOL's rules seek to limit the ability of kids to milk cows or feed calves. I also fear this rule will restrict the ability of youth to work with any livestock for the purpose of education. My school district is the only district in the county that still funds an ag education program. But in the current budget year for Dairy Area School District, ag ed was cut by 50%. Last year we had 2 ag teachers instructing over 120 students in 14 classes. This year we're left with 1 ag teacher reaching 80 students in 6 classes. DOL's rule would have our remaining ag teacher rebuild his curriculum to achieve safety requirements and then try to squeeze in all the other aspects of farming and ag business. The rule restricts 14 and 15-year-olds from farm activities unless they're enrolled in ag education and complete 90 hours of safety training. If you think about 90 hours of safety training and with a high school class of between 45 and 60 minutes, you're talking over 18 weeks or at least half of the school year that they're devoted to safety training only. And that only leaves that portion of the rest of the year for any type of career development. In my area, there are several students who enjoy working on a neighbor's farm during the summer months for various reasons, but they cannot be enrolled in the ag education program because their school doesn't offer it, and because they're really not planning on a career in agriculture. But the work performed by these students is still valuable and needed, and it allows them to earn a wage that they can put away for college. As my boys were growing up, they would help me put hay away. Working on the hay wagon and in the barn's hayloft occurs at elevations over 6 feet on my farm. DOL's height restrictions may be intended for 30-foot ladders, but unfortunately it would disallow the process of placing hay in storage on many farms. Mindful of safety, I provided opportunities to my children to learn hands-on in the hands-on environment, whether it was an impact wrench, screw gun, power washer, or an electric feed cart. My children were safely operating powered equipment on the farm with appropriate levels of adult supervision and safety precautions. It's taken literally. DOL standards would prohibit most activities on around my farm. Without being harshly critical of DOL's position on power equipment, the days of hand and foot powered equipment has passed. Technology has offered much safer and more efficient means to accomplish farm tasks. On my farm, no one operates equipment unless I am comfortable with their ability and the level of risk associated with their job. Thank you for this opportunity, and I entertain any questions at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Everett. Appreciate your time and being here today. I'll go ahead and begin our questioning. And I'd like to start with Mr. Tabb, if I may. I understand that Commissioner Douglas couldn't be here today because he's appearing before your legislature's Budget Committee. In a time of declining and tightening state budgets, will state education agencies and local school districts be in a position to provide more safety training, or should DOL continue to allow federal extension services to provide those programs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We definitely believe that the programs that are in place are working. And the study that I'll cite is the Childhood Agriculture Injury Study that was actually sanctioned by NIOSH, was done at WVU in Morgantown, and actually is one of the most current studies on childhood injuries that's out there. A lot of the data was in this rule was old data. But to show a 59% decrease in the amount of injuries over the last 11 years truly shows that education and technology have both helped to move this forward. So we're, with the cutting budgets, what's available through extension, through 4-H, through the current programs, if the numbers had gone the other way on this study, I think there would be a different mindset because none of us want children to get injured.
Certainly. In your testimony, you'd addressed the Ag HO that is talking about extreme temperatures, and you joked that in order to comply with the ever-changing weather, it would probably be necessary to hire a full-time meteorologist. You've been around this. Don't you think most parents, supervisors who supervise their children know when it's time to come in from the outside?
That, and not only the children, but the employer, the farmer who's got them there. If he doesn't keep his help, whether it's his own children, over 16, over 18, 14 to 16, if he doesn't keep them hydrated and in reasonable accommodations, you're not going to get any work. You don't get productivity. I furnished the Gatorade and that type thing to them, but it's, I just can't understand. It's making the assumption that every farmer is some evil person who their goal is to have children harmed on their operation. And I don't think the statistics show that of the reporting and the, like I said in my statements about the liability, of if you're negligent and you let somebody, whether they're 14 or 16 or 25, is negligently hurt on your farm operation, you've got something to deal with, both with penalties and liabilities on lawsuits.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Chin, I'm glad. We probably have some other people in here that knows what buck and bales mean, so not to get you. Appreciated that. Everyone has testified today that they're not only farmers but also a parent. In your experience, do other blood relatives such as grandparents, aunts, uncles all share that same level of concern for well-being of our children?
They do. I love my children more than anything in this world, and I'd never do anything to put them in harm's way.
The government doesn't have to tell you to care about your children?
No, they don't.
Okay.
But my mother-in-law, she's more possessive of my children's safety than I could ever think about being. Someone made that comment earlier about being a grandparent and not letting your grandchildren do what your children do. My mother-in-law is a perfect example of that. My husband started going out in the hog lot, out in dirt lots at the age of 5 behind his mom and dad. Luckily, because of science and technology, we've been able to move our hogs indoors now in a climate control computer system that keeps it like air conditioning in the summertime, and it's heated in the winter, so it's year-round 70 degrees inside our hog barns. That's a very safe environment for our children to be in. But my husband, as a child, didn't have that luxury, And my mother-in-law every day thinks about what she's doing with her grandchildren and how she wants to teach them how to care for the livestock and care for our environment so that someday they're teaching their grandchildren the same thing that she's doing. She would never, ever put our children in harm's way.
She'd never tell them to run in front of a tractor or...
It's interesting you brought that up. My children learned at a very young age to get out of the way of a tractor. Yet we had a State Department worker who was there doing an inspection on our family farm that we had to ask to get out of the way so he did not get run over by a tractor.
The government expert. Okay. You know, you mentioned that your 14-year-old daughter, Rachel, had visited the emergency room 3 times, never been injured on the family farm, injured at school. So do you believe there's a need for the Department of Labor in this administration to try and regulate so many facets of everyday life?
No, I think the Department of Labor may be well-intentioned, but I don't think they fully understand what we do on our farms and our ranches today. My children have never once been injured on our farm, but I send them to school and I get phone calls that I need to take them to the emergency room because they have a concussion as a result of a basketball injury, or their hip gets pulled out of place doing a layup. These are the types of phone calls that I get, and I've been there and I've watched it happen. But I've never put my child in harm's way out on our family farm. If something's not safe for her to do, I'm not going to let her do it. Because when you get that phone call that your child's been hurt, there's nothing worse in the world. It breaks your heart. And you want to take care of your child. And I don't need the government coming out here telling me how to love my daughter, because that's something that the day I gave birth to her was automatic. It was even before I gave birth to her that I loved that little girl. Absolutely.
Thanks. And you're leading the charge on basketball regulation, I understand. So.
No.
Mr. Sheshky, I have here a letter from some of my local county commissioners in my district out of Delta County. In the second sentence of the letter, it states, skills learned by youths working on farms and in livestock production programs such as FFA and 4-H and Teens on Farm programs instill a lifelong ethic towards safety that is unparalleled by other education efforts. Would you agree with that statement?
I would, and I think the idea that students learn best in context. You can teach students about safety, but when they see the real-life application of that, and I think that's where the opportunity to not only combine what we do in a classroom, but then follow that right up with the ability for students to work in that environment and see the application. So many of the problems we have in our education system today is that kids learn something, but they don't immediately see the connection or the context to it. And I think that the ability for our students to have this experiential learning and to work in agriculture, it brings into that context of, yes, there are safety issues and things that they have to be aware of, but the more they're educated on them, it would. One of the concerns I've heard come from one of our teachers that if these rules were to go forward and our students really wouldn't have the opportunity to be involved in experiential learning, then why would the unintended consequences may be actually a decreased amount of time in the instruction program on safety. As was noted, you know, to completely comply with what is proposed, that you would eat up over half of the year just teaching safety. There has to be a reasonable part of that. Safety is important, and it should be not necessarily half the year, but it really needs to be infused all the way through the instructional program. So students are learning about livestock, they learn about safety. If they're learning about equipment, they're learning about safety. If they're learning about crops, they're learning about the safety aspects of that at the same time.
Right. You know, I'm a country boy, so when you're saying experiential learning, learning by doing is essentially what you're really talking about. Are you as concerned as I am about the provisions in the proposed rule that would prevent future generations from learning important skills, how to handle the hogs, and techniques critical to farming as a result of DOL's hands-off approach?
I am, and part of it is that, you know, the communists may that doesn't affect it, but it does because of the limiting of the student exemption to only the first 2 HOs. Imagine how difficult it would be to place a student in a work situation, employment situation, working on a farm, where the list of things that they could not do was longer than the things they could do. And so that's where I think we would like to see, if they do go forward with this many HOs, that student learner cover as many of them that it really makes sense to. Because, you know, how many employers are going to hire those student learners when they know that technically by the DOL standard, 12 of the things are on this list they cannot do. Only 2 are allowed, and that's a pretty narrow scope in terms of the opportunities for the students to learn exponentially.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Ebert, a common comment we hear from stakeholders is typically a lack of initial outreach by federal agencies. What should DOL do that will better inform, or better yet, make you a partner in this rulemaking process?
It's my understanding in the state we actually have a rural safety board and agency, but it hasn't been funded. So how's an agency that hasn't been funded able to reach out to the community and help them with safety? I think it would be in DOL's best interest to work along those lines instead of imposing more rules on our farming community.
Great, thanks. You know, if you were prohibited from working on your family's farm as a youth, do you think that you would be as involved or involved at all in production today?
No, not at all, because I just wouldn't have the experience and develop the love of the farm aspect and the animals in the industry.
Learn by doing.
Right.
Great. Thanks so much. I'd like to yield to Ranking Member Kritz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my most important question is for Ms. Chin. So your daughter had her hip pulled out doing a layup?
Yeah, she did. She
what
got
kind of basketball do they play in your neighborhood?
Middle school basketball is very rough for girls, I can tell you.
I wasn't allowed to play basketball because I played it like football, but it sounds like that works well.
Yeah, we need helmets and pads.
Mr. Shesky, I think you mentioned that 2/3 of the FFA students are non-farming community students, or I missed the percentage of what you said.
Roughly 2/3 of the students we serve today come from non-farm backgrounds, meaning only 1/3 of our students today fall in this category of having grown up on a family farm. This 2/3 is roughly divided between the students that we would consider rural non-farm, meaning students who live in those rural areas. And those are the students that are probably most affected by some of this, because their opportunity for that experiential learning is often working for farmers in that community, and in some kind of wage earning place that's part of this SAE, Supervised Agriculture Experience Program. But also we have today roughly 1/3 of our students who come from suburban and urban neighborhoods, because the idea of agriculture in its broadest sense is not limited to just rural areas. Finding that young people today, even in the suburban areas, our largest programs in the country are actually in places like Chicago and Philadelphia. And it's one model that actually provides a lot of growth opportunity for our programs.
Thanks. I think we'd all probably agree that working on a farm is hard work. So when you have hard work, sometimes accidents will happen. I mean, I think that's just a natural progression. And, you know, I was thinking about this, and I have a list of questions I wanted to go through, but I was actually, I think what has come up with this, talking about defining where young people can work, whether it's a family farm or not a family farm, and defining, of course, what a family farm is that obviously over time the procedures that you use in your operations and the equipment that you use changes. And it seems to me that you adjust and have training or make sure that the folks on your farm understand the new dangers, so to speak. And it seems like DOL's purpose might be served better at the front end, not at the back end. And I'd really open up that to everyone, if you just want to go, well, my right to left, because I'd be curious what you do when you get that new piece of equipment or the new technique that you have to adjust. And not only do your children have to know what the new processes are, but everyone up the chain as well. So please.
Right. Anytime we get a new piece of equipment on our farm, there's a training period. Nobody's allowed to use it till they've gone through the training period with it. They understand it. They're fully comfortable with the rules and the safety procedures that go along with that. The same holds true for our children. Anytime that we feel like they're ready to move on to the next step, they don't get to do it without hearing the proper safety guidelines to using that piece of equipment or to being around that older animal. We would never turn somebody loose without that proper training. It's not common sense. We don't want somebody to get hurt. We don't have time for somebody to get hurt.
I'd like to comment. It's an important issue because from our standpoint, the classroom instruction, our teachers are always in need of and looking for resources to better teach safety, and the idea of how do you have appropriate safety assessments. And we do pretty well for all the equipment they're contained in the school, and that's pretty much a given. When we go out into the workplace situations, that's where the teacher has to work with that farmer, the person who's employing that student, to make sure that the student in that training agreement covers that. Mentioned in the earlier panel that this is something DOL is interested in. In fact, we would welcome them from an educational standpoint, making sure that if there's resources at DOL and maybe resources at USDA, to make sure that for students who are in these situations that we're providing the best education, and that we have the assessments in place to make sure that those students are qualified. Our teachers are striving to do the best they can with the resources that they had, and what the gentleman at the end of the table described is happening in a lot of our schools. You know, our programs are under a lot of financial constraints, and they're having to do more with less. So any assistance rather versus regulation that could be given would be probably well received and appreciated.
Thank you. And the one thing that I would, into my context, is a farm is actually an outdoor classroom and laboratory, and that's where they can get the hands-on experience through the vocational programs at the schools. And I'll go back to these statistics again. You know, for the injury per 1,000 farms in 1998 on the farms was 16.6 per 1,000, and in 2009 it was down to 16.8. That drop of 59%. You know, if playing high school sports was an occupation, then for every 1,000 players that you would have less than 1% injured during a year, I think not. Just because they're being compensated for something to do, and a lot of kids love to do sports. In fact, they're encouraged to do sports. Physical activity is actually supposed to be good for you. And being on a farm in that environment doing the physical activity, that you do sometimes get hurt. I think if you look at it statistically, it's a lot safer than playing organized sports. Like I say, as an EMT, I was a volunteer EMT in my community for 18 years. Been in the lifetime member of the fire department. And I've been thinking about this for a couple weeks. In the 18 years that I was a certified EMT, wasn't just a driver, but I was a certified EMT for the back of that ambulance, I cannot still think of one incident, and I'm glad, of either a fatality or a serious injury involving a farm youth worker. On a regular basis on Friday nights, I went on the ambulance to the high school football team games on standby, and very seldom we ever left there without transporting somebody to the hospital. You know, that people get hurt. But I think if they do a little bit of, you know, compared to what, if farming is the only thing you can compare it to, yes, it's going to be the most dangerous, but it will also be the safest. But I think just looking at organized sports, and with that, they're making improvements. They're doing new head protection. And agriculture is doing the same thing. As a kid growing up, for me, probably the biggest single improvement in agriculture that I've seen in my lifetime was slip shafts on power takeoffs. That was probably the most dangerous thing on a farm. When that thing started spinning, and all it took was a thread to get into that, and you could just be wrapped up in that thing in a heartbeat. But all the technology that's come along, you know, over the last years, it's phenomenal. And I'm proud to be a farmer. You know, I'm not ashamed to be a farmer. So thank you.
I'm going to sort of add on to his. You know, I can remember when I started working with my dad, you know, the older machinery they had, the power takeoffs were open, you know, nothing was covered, belts and everything didn't have shields on, where today's modern machinery does. A lot of stuff has quick shut-offs, all of that. And I've always taught my kids. I always matched my kid to the ability of what he could do in the task at hand. And I always stressed, and they always learn, if you're working with a piece of equipment, if something goes wrong, the first thing you do is shut the whole thing down. Don't risk losing an arm, a finger, or your life. And I think that's what, you know, farmers do today. They realize that farming is highly mechanized and highly computerized, but there's still a lot of danger out there, and those things that we teach them is, you know, for their safety and our safety for our children. Okay.
Well, and I think that's not. I think, and that's really the point I think that we're talking about is that Mr. Bartlett said earlier that many times regulations and the government comes in because the person or the constituent or the consumer doesn't have the mental wherewithal without our help. And many times it's, I mean, because things can be inherently dangerous. I mean, farming, there is danger involved with farming. And, you know, there is obviously health and welfare, health and safety that have to be taken into account. But the point I was trying to make is that the farmer is doing exactly what the government wants, what anybody would want. And when it comes down to your own family, I think sometimes we push our own families a little harder than we might other families, but still the safety of that individual is paramount. And one of the things that struck me, too, with farming as I've delved more and more into the subject is the education level of farmers anymore. I mean, the amount of the amount of people in the farming community now with bachelor's degrees from college certainly even says that the government saying that, well, you know, maybe they're not educated, maybe they don't know, so we have to help, is even further from the truth. So I really appreciate your testimony. I obviously the point is that we do a very good job of one size fits all, and this is one place where maybe the previous size fit well, and if it's not broke, let's not fix it. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. King.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank all the witnesses. I don't know when I've listened to a whole panel of witnesses and agreed with every one of you. I appreciate the background experience you bring to this and the comments. First, I think, Mr. Tabb, your comment about put the grandparents in charge, that really hits home. For some reason, the reproduction part is out of our control, and we realize how precious these kids are, especially when they're grandchildren, and not to diminish being a parent, and I'm both. I appreciate your comments also, Mrs. Chen, and I wanted to say to you that your oral testimony was even better than your written testimony, and I would suggest the congressional record of your testimony would be very useful to put in a farm magazine. And I'd like to see that read in the urban areas if there's a way that we can advocate that through FFA or anywhere else, because that picks up the flavor of this and the sense of what the way of life is like. And I also, the comments about the inspector doesn't know to get out of the way, but the kids do. Yes, that's simple common sense. It transcends species. And if you've ever tried to herd confinement hogs on dirt, you know that. If you have ever taken a kennel-raised field trial champion bird dog out to the actual field and realized that that dog doesn't know how to get across the creek or through the fence, kids are the same way. If they grow up on the farm, they learn these things incrementally. The best safety you can have is you watch those kids and you see what they know, you know where their weaknesses are, you know where the dangers are, and you're constantly there to make sure they avoid the dangers, including none of our little kids got near the limited-fed sows during gestation. That would be the most dangerous thing I can actually think of, and horrifying included. The statement that you testified, Mr. Tabb, on, and I've just looked it up here because the language struck home with me, where the temperatures at which they are working exceed or drop below a certain temperature, factoring in such things as humidity, wind velocity, and the degree and duration of the physical exertion required by the work, in direct sun be limited, the temperature reaches certain thresholds for prolonged periods of time. I just have to tell you that Marilyn and I have raised 3 sons, and they are grown now in their 30s. The oldest one sat down with me a couple of years ago, and he said, Dad, do you remember when you had us out working when it was 126 degrees heat index? I said, yeah, I do, actually. That was an unusual day, but we had the form set, and we had to pour concrete, and we made money. He said, that's what you said, Dad. You said we made money. But do you remember 2 days in a row where we were out driving sheet piling across the swamp when it was 60 below wind chill? I said, yeah, I do remember that, too, because we didn't have to mat the drag line, and we made money. He said, that's what you said, Dad. But what I wanted to tell you is that that's 186 degrees temperature range between 60 below and 126 above, and no species other than your sons would survive such an ordeal. But all 3 of those sons, they are grown up, and they all work. They enjoy work, and work is an honorable thing. And the life that we have in rural America is among the most honorable that we have. And when it's threatened, I'm concerned about it, and it comes to me in a lot the same way it does Danny Rehberg and many others that have had the benefits of living in this way. I just think that it's a mistake for us to even think about lowering the I guess they would say raising the standards. I say lowering the standards for youth to work, because the work ethic and the way of life is so valuable, and our trust that we should have in the people that are the parents, the grandparents, the neighbors, the relation, and the mentors for these children should be adequate. I trust them, and I trust the parents to make the judgment as to who they will trust their children's safety to. And I would pose this question: should we, instead of adding regulation to agriculture, should we instead lift some of the regulations for non-farm work for our youth so that they could learn a work ethic in the neighboring business? And should we allow parents to sign a waiver so that they could allow their children to go to work in a neighboring business with somebody that they trust, rather than having more regulation tighten this down and eventually choke off our work ethic? Would it be better to allow that opportunity for many other children aside, in addition to agriculture? And I start with Ms. Chin.
I think that would be a great idea. Our local newspaper owner in our town would love to be training young kids to just stuff papers, but he can't because of the labor rules. He cannot hire a 13-year-old kid to come in and stuff inserts into his newspaper. But what a great thing for a child to learn, the value of hard work, that when I work hard at something, I'm going to get paid for it. And then I can have that pride of ownership in that newspaper when it gets delivered into mom and dad's mailbox the next day. These are things that our kids are not being allowed to do today. They're not learning this at a young age, but they all know how to play a video game real good. But how's that benefit everybody in life? What these kids learn in a job, they're going to take with them as they grow older. And we're going to have a great workforce, and we're going to have kids that know responsibility and the value of hard work, and that it doesn't matter how big that obstacle is. If you set your mind to it, you can achieve anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Shesky?
Agriculture education is one of the few career and technical education programs that allow students to really get involved and engage as early as middle school and junior high. In fact, most of the career and technical education programs, meaning outside of agriculture, are really only limited to students in their junior and senior year in high school. And the advantage is that it's much easier under current regulations to make sure those students have that experiential learning. In fact, I would say that a lot of those, the part of the whole career technical education model that they struggle with the most is providing students the relevant experiential learning by doing. Often they're creating that within the classroom. But in our case, you know, the farm, as it was alluded to by Mr. Tabb and others, is an opportunity to extend that learning environment out into the community and kids to get real-life learning experiences and actually save money that helps them go on to college or do other things that helps advance their career. And I think that's another part of this whole financial literacy piece that, back to your comment about one of the inherent advantages young people in rural America have, is that because they have the opportunity to work in those situations, earn money, they become a lot probably more financially literate and responsible with that funds than do their counterparts who have never had that experience.
Thank you. Mr. Tabb?
Absolutely. You know, urban youth should be afforded the same opportunities that rural youth have. And since we don't have many urban farms, a little bit of container growing here and there. But, you know, growing up on a farm and working, I had 5 siblings. There were 6 of us kids. And one Sunday morning, a lady came up to my dad and says, Mr. Tabb, says, your children are so well behaved in church, I'd like my son to sit with you one Sunday. And he said, well, that's fine. And he said, I'd like to have him by Friday, but Saturday morning at the very latest. We didn't have time to get in trouble. But you know, we were taught that work ethic at a young age. In fact, that's something, if you want to do something mandatory, put a work ethics requirement in anybody to graduate from high school. That would, I think you would find that would be a real good part to a well-rounded education. But allowing young people, whether they're in the country or in the urban area, to actually be able to learn something, learn a trade, learn how to change oil in a vehicle, or how to properly measure something before you know, you would put it together. Because I've been a tremendous proponent of vocational education. And you know, a lot of kids that are at risk can't see a reason to stay in school, if they can see practical application, they'll stay in school. If they can learn how to read calipers, to be an auto mechanic, or to figure how many cubic yards of concrete it's going to take for that footer of foundation, It's amazing how you can keep these kids involved, but if you got to make them wait until they're beyond that threshold to have that curiosity to want to learn, you're starting to lose a lot of them.
Thank you. Mr. Ebert?
Yeah, I think we need to back off on some of those regulations because I think kids today have so much opportunity to get involved in work-related activities and opportunities. Why don't we want to stifle them? Let them start early. They're going to grow so much more and make America greater than what it is now by giving them that opportunity.
Thank you. And just briefly in closing, to support a statement that I just added up the times that we've been to the emergency room. We have had 2 knee surgeries and a broken femur, and none of them had to do with any of the work that those young men did. It all had to do with sports or recreational. Thank you very much, all of you witnesses, and I appreciate especially the statements made in conclusion here, and I yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman King. Appreciate the panel taking the time to be here. Mr. Ebert, I think you had a nice summation about the greatness of America, and we find it in the traditions of our agricultural community. And certainly appreciate, Ms. Chin, also your notification that I think government maybe needs to hear, that moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas do not need government to tell them how to love their children and how to be able to protect them, that we see that caring here. So I would like to thank all the witnesses for taking time out of their busy schedules for appearing today. And you've all provided us with some great insights on how decisions made in Washington are affecting small businesses across our country, most in particular our ag community. I'd also like to remind the Department of Labor, as they make these decisions, that 98% of the domestic farms are defined as family farms, and that 96.7% of these are defined as small businesses. Small businesses are the greatest job creator and are responsible for, on average, 7 out of every 10 new jobs in our country. It's my hope today that the Department of Labor will consider all the comments made here today when deciding whether or not to move forward with the NPRM or certain provisions within that NPRM. Well, I think we can all agree that the safety of our youth should be a foremost concern, and the initial purpose behind the proposed rule may have been well-intentioned. I would like to reiterate that I believe that, as the majority of American farmers do, that this rule altogether should have never been proposed. The rule as offered would change long-standing and proven programs that provide training to young people who are interested in pursuing careers in agriculture. This is bad for agricultural small businesses, and it's bad for the future of our nation's farming needs. I'd like to recommend to the DOL to reconsider that rule in its entirety. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to be able to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered, and this hearing is now adjourned. Again, thank you.